Today, perhaps more than ever before, women are being subtly conditioned to believe that the silence of their body is a sign of absence, that it is a mark of emptiness, a symptom of emotional failure. But what if that belief is completely backwards? What if that silence isn't a void, but the soul's very first whisper? What if, when a woman chooses, whether consciously or not, to withdraw from the performative games of desire in the invisible prisons of shallow affection, something far deeper begins to rise from within her, something ancient, something true. This is not absence. This is presence. It is not lack. It is a sacred expansion. If this message stirred something quiet inside you, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel where silence speaks, and the soul is never alone. Carl Jung once said that all repressed energy finds new forms of expression, and when the body no longer seeks distraction and immediate pleasure, the soul finally begins to speak. Have you ever noticed how many women, after long periods of abstinence, describe sudden, almost mystical awakenings? Their dreams grow more vivid. Their intuition sharpens. Their senses become more alive. This isn't coincidence. It's not a strange side effect. It's a calling. The body, once deprived of external touch, begins to turn inward. And within that forgotten inner territory, the woman begins to rediscover fragments of herself that had been buried unseen not only by others, but even by her own awareness. And make no mistake, this is not just about celibacy. It's about transmutation, a transformation of energy, an energy that stops searching outside and begins to bloom within. Society, built on a system of endless sexual validation, fears the woman who turns inward because she becomes unpredictable, mysterious, untouchable, and perhaps most threatening of all, she begins to see beyond the script, beyond the emotional loops, beyond the mass of relationships that trap more than they liberate. Jung would call this the first meeting with the shadow. That pivotal moment when a woman no longer seeks to be chosen, but instead begins to choose. Not to love so that she might be loved in return, but to love herself so fiercely, so wholly, that all things superficial fall away like dust. There is a kind of silence that does not reflect emptiness. It is the silence of a sacred space, a temple, and when the body comes to stillness, it's because the soul is preparing to set a fire, a light not everyone is ready to see. A woman who lives without sex or relationships is not emotionally dead. She may be more alive than she has ever been. What appears as absence on the surface is often the presence of something deeper, something vibrant within. What looks like loneliness is in truth a communion, a deep, almost wordless connection with something no passing desire could ever reach. It is within this space that the archetype of the wild woman begins to awaken. She who remembers her lineage. She who honors her instinct. She who embodies the feminine that does not perform, that does not need applause. Can you feel it? This path isn't for everyone. It's not for those who fear solitude or stillness. It's for those who are tired of exchanging their essence for moments of simulated intimacy. It's for the woman who has finally realized that what she truly longs for does not live in someone else's bed, but in the most radical encounter of all the encounter with herself. And if you're still here, still listening, maybe you're closer to that journey than you realize. Yes, the body grows quiet, but that stillness is not weakness. It is strength turning inward, refining itself into power. And once the soul begins to speak, nothing can silence it again. Because a woman who has truly heard her soul will never again settle for the faint volume of ordinary love. There comes a moment in every woman's life when the noise becomes unbearable. Not the chaos outside, but the internal murmur, the pressure of desires that were never hers, the pull of expectations she was taught to carry, affections presented as truths. And in that silent exhaustion, almost invisible to others, her true journey begins. Jung once said, "Everything we repress returns as fate." And maybe that's exactly why, when the body chooses stillness, it's not a sign of collapse. It's a signal that something much larger is trying to be born. The woman who begins to step back from her usual impulses, even without fully knowing why, is already hearing a new call. A call not from flesh, but from soul. Even without understanding it clearly, she begins to feel a longing with no name. It's not a yearning for a man, not a craving for touch or lust or companionship. It is a deeper nostalgia, a reaching towards some part of herself she hasn't yet met, but already believes in. In this light, abstinence is not a sentence, it's a portal. And crossing through it marks the beginning of what Jung called individuation, the movement toward inner wholeness, a journey that requires her to stop projecting her worth onto others and instead to recognize it within herself. The emptiness she encounters is not a void, it is preparation. It is sacred space being cleared for something real to arrive. And in that space, even her memories begin to change form. They no longer hurt as wounds. They begin to shimmer as signs, as clues to a greater narrative unfolding within her. The lovers that passed, the tears that stained the night, the cycles that repeated without logic. Now they all begin to make sense through a different lens. Because the woman who welcomes silence is not escaping life. She is choosing to rewrite her story from the inside out. Her inner self, once muffled by noise and need, begins to awaken. And suddenly emotions no longer control her, they reveal her. They become symbols, messages, reflections of a self that had always been there, just unheard beneath the clamor of desire. Slowly, she learns she no longer craves applause. She doesn't need eyes upon her. She doesn't measure her value by how many desire her form. Her worth now lies in how deeply she can hold her own presence in stillness. It is in this shift that something powerful, almost mystical, begins to stir. The emergence of a woman who no longer needs to be chosen. And that is the moment the world begins to tremble. Because society does not know what to do with a woman who has stopped begging for love. She becomes dangerous because she is whole, and everything that still lives in halves cannot touch her. And when that woman finally begins to recognize that her vital energy is not dormant but merely withdrawn, she steps into an entirely new state of consciousness. A state where urgency dissolves, where the need to prove anything to anyone fades quietly away, because the silence of the body is not a sentence of punishment, it is a language, and that language speaks only to those courageous enough to descend into the deepest places within themselves. Jung would call this moment a reconciliation with the feminine unconscious, a sacred return, a reawakening of ancient symbols that have long been buried beneath generations of repression. But this kind of reunion doesn't occur through words. It happens through presence. That woman is just beginning to rise, to emerge. But the journey is anything but easy. There is a restlessness, a subtle unease, an invisible anguish that gnaws quietly from within. When a woman begins to remove herself from the pull of immediate desire, from familiar hands, from the nearness of a body that once offered comfort, she is also withdrawing from everything that once defined her place in the world. And what is left, at least at first, is a brutal discomfort, as if the world no longer registers her presence, as if stepping away from the dance of desire renders her invisible. Jung would say this is the first glimpse of the shadow, the very part of her that had been buried for years, the self that adapted endlessly, that starved for approval, but now, at last, refuses to keep pretending. And in this raw exposure, questions start to rise. Was I wrong to walk away? Am I unraveling, wasting time, beauty, opportunity, because the voices of society scream that a woman's time is fleeting, that she must always be in motion, winning, attracting, fulfilling roles and fantasies, and suddenly, she doesn't belong anywhere. She's not the muse, not the lover, not the wife, not even the girlfriend. She's only herself. And that isolation stings deeper than any heartbreak. Even abstinence, once chosen freely, now begins to wear the mask of punishment. But it's not punishment. It's a test, a symbolic rite of passage, one that only the most prepared souls can withstand. Temptations will surface, old stories will knock, familiar patterns will seduce. Opportunities that once seemed harmless will reappear. It's as if everything around her is conspiring to test her resolve. And the cruelest part of all, no one sees it. Friends worry. They ask questions. Family urges her to go out, to rejoin the world. But it's not isolation. It's immersion. And few are prepared to witness a soul descending while the rest of the world floats lightly above. Jung recognized this as a vital phase in individuation. The moment the ego trembles, losing its grip, while the soul, in quiet determination, begins to take command. And in that silence, in that despair, many women return to what they know. They fall back into familiar arms, settle for lukewarm love, convince themselves that something is better than nothing. But the woman who remains, who stays through the ache and the ambiguity, is being reshaped by something far more powerful than she can yet understand. She is being called to break the pattern. And patterns are not broken with force. They are undone with awareness. The tension she feels is not a mistake. It is the moment before transformation. The cocoon always tightens before the butterfly can break free. And that is exactly what is happening. A new self is being formed, gestated silently in the womb of stillness, somewhere deep down. She knows it, even if she cannot name it, even if the aloneness frightens her, even if she feels too strange, too unseen, too much. There is a voice that does not shout, but it does not stop. A presence, not visible, but constant. And that presence carries the essence of the archetypal feminine, the anima, as Jung called her, the bridge between the known and the mysterious, between surface and soul. It is with this presence that the woman begins a new kind of dialogue, and the deeper the conversation goes, the more her understanding blooms. Her body is not frozen. It is in sacred ritual, a ritual the modern world has forgotten, but one her soul has always remembered how to walk. And then, quietly, something shifts, almost imperceptibly. What was once agitation begins to form into deeper questions. Why did I always need to feel desired, to feel alive? Why is the absence of another so unbearable? What part of me still feeds on the eyes of others in order to feel like I exist? Because the woman who keeps her silence is not running from life. She is not giving up. She is crafting her story from a place the world cannot touch. Her inner self begins to witness her emotions not as chaos, but as mirrors. Mirrors reflecting pieces of an unconscious that had always whispered to her. But that desire had drowned out. Little by little, she realizes something vital. She no longer needs applause. She doesn't need the spotlight or the soft approval in someone's gaze. Her worth doesn't depend on how many admire her figure. It lies in how deeply she can sit with the presence of her soul alone, in stillness. And it's at this precise moment that something almost mythical awakens, the power of a woman who no longer needs to be chosen. And from that moment on, the world begins to fear her, because no one knows what to do with a woman who refuses to beg for love. She becomes whole, and that wholeness is a quiet revolution, a threat to everything that still survives in fragments. And when that woman, once again, begins to realize that her vital force is not asleep, only gathered within, she re-enters that state of awakened consciousness, a space without urgency, without hunger for recognition. Because the silence of the body is not exile. It is a dialect, a sacred one, and only those brave enough to explore the vast interior of the self will ever learn to speak it. Jung called it the reconciliation with the feminine unconscious, the re-encounter with archetypal wisdom, buried and guarded through centuries of suppression. And again, it's not a reunion made with words, but with presence, and the woman. She is only just beginning to rise. But the path ahead, it is not gentle. Restlessness returns. Anguish stirs quiet, but fierce, unseen, but felt in every breath. When a woman begins to pull away from immediate desire, from the touch she once craved, from the familiar warmth of another body beside her, she isn't just creating distance from others. She is stepping away from everything that once made her feel like she belonged. And what she finds in the beginning is not peace, but a raw, ruthless discomfort, as if the world suddenly stops recognizing her existence, as if, by exiting the theater of desire, she becomes invisible. Jung would describe this as the initial confrontation with the shadow, that silent, hidden part of her, the one that had spent years adapting, thirsting for validation, shape-shifting for approval. But now, it rises, no longer willing to pretend. And in this new space, questions begin to stir. Was it a mistake to withdraw? Am I losing my mind? Is this solitude a waste of youth, of time, of chances? Because the system we live in screams at her every day. A woman's time is short. She must keep moving, keep conquering, keep being seen, wanted, chosen, and fulfilled. And suddenly, she no longer fits. She is no longer the lover, no longer the wife, not the muse, not the fiancée. She is just herself. And that stings in a way abandonment never did. Abstinence now starts to take the shape of punishment, but it isn't. It is a test, a spiritual trial, a symbolic journey that only a soul prepared for deep transformation can survive. Temptations rise. Old behaviors tap gently at the door. Invitations return like ghosts familiar, easy, seductive. Everything seems calibrated to lure her back. And the most painful part? No one seems to understand. Friends raise their eyebrows. Family urges her to go out, to stop isolating, to live. But this isn't isolation. It is immersion. And most people are simply not ready to watch someone dive into herself, while they remain tethered to the surface. Jung recognized this moment as an essential stage of individuation, the threshold where ego begins to panic, sensing its control slipping, while the soul, silent and certain, begins to rise. It's in this silent unraveling that many give up. They return to what's familiar. They reach for old comforts. They settle for lukewarm affection. And they convince themselves that something is better than nothing. But the woman who stays even when her cheeks are wet with doubt, even when she trembles with fear is being reshaped by something infinitely greater than herself, She is being summoned to break the cycle. And cycles don't break by force. They dissolve through awareness. That tension she feels deep within isn't failure. It's the pressure of transformation. Just as the cocoon tightens before the wings emerge, this pain is a signal. A new self is being born, gestating quietly in the darkness of her own silence. And somehow, she knows, even if she cannot explain it, even if she fears she's too different, too alone, too deep. There is a voice inside her that doesn't yell, but it never stops whispering, a presence that remains invisible, but faithfully close. That presence is the archetypal feminine, the anima that Jung described, a bridge between her conscious mind and the mystery that lives beneath it. It is with this ancient, sacred essence that she begins to communicate. And the more that dialogue unfolds inwardly, the more she begins to understand. Her body is not on hold. It is in ritual, a ritual our modern culture has forgotten, but one her soul always remembered how to walk. Then, something shifts, subtle, soft, but irreversible. What used to feel like restlessness now gathers itself into deeper questions. Why have I always believed that being desired meant being alive? Why is the absence of another person so unbearable? What part of me still survives by feeding on someone else's gaze? The woman who once fell silent out of pain now begins to speak through truth. She no longer tolerates relationships as anesthesia. She will not trade affection for mere company. And even if this means enduring nights filled with silence, she knows her body is not in deprivation. It is in protection. It is guarding sacred ground, making room for something that rises from the soul, not from emptiness. The transformation is complete the moment she realizes she no longer needs to be sought after. She is the source, the fire, the revealing light. And when that light ignites, those unable to withstand its brightness will walk away, and those who come after will not dare approach her halfway. Because the woman who has walked through the valley of her own silence refuses to live dimmed ever again. She no longer fits within ordinary relationships, because she, herself, is no longer ordinary. When the body falls quiet, it is the soul that begins to choose. And the soul, once awakened, never returns to what once harmed it. She doesn't come back to the world as she was. She becomes the world. Every step is chosen. Every action shaped not by the fear of being alone, but by the sacred worth of her own company. The body that once hushed itself now vibrates at a completely different frequency. Subtler, deeper, truer. There is no rush to patch the empty spaces. No need to force herself into roles or relationships too small for who she has become. Carl Jung said, "What we deny submits us. What we integrate transforms us." And this woman has finally done it. She has integrated her absence, made peace with lack, turned silence into sanctuary. But there is something the world often fails to notice. She is not waiting to be rescued, because a woman who has traveled through her own darkness no longer needs saving. She saved herself, and that changes everything. She cannot return to what was. What once felt like hunger is now discernment. What once was need has become sacred choice. Yes, she can love, but she no longer loves from longing. She loves from overflow. And when love finally arrives, it will not come to complete her. It will come to walk beside her, because her soul is already whole. This new state awakens something far greater than satisfaction. It births purpose. It summons clarity. It ignites a deep knowing that her experience was never just hers. It was a symbol. That her silenced body represents the countless women taught to depend, to numb themselves, to surrender their essence for safety. And now she becomes the quiet fire, not to lead others, but to remind them what it means to burn without apology. And now she feels the quiet yet undeniable impulse to become a beacon, not to guide others by pointing out the path, but to light the flame, because only a woman who has truly met herself in the dark can teach others not to be afraid of it. Jung would name this moment as the full manifestation of the self, that rare turning point when the soul stops begging for acceptance and starts craving expression. Everything she lost along the way, the old romances, the fragile versions of herself, the roles where she had to shrink and bend to fit, they no longer carry the weight of pain. Now, each loss rings like liberation. Every absence echoes like an answered prayer. Because the woman who passed through the fire of bodily abstinence discovered a deeper nourishment, one that rises from the soul, and that nourishment now feeds her from within, endlessly. Nothing outside her will ever be enough, unless it resonates with what already lives deep inside. She no longer prepares herself to return to old roles. She prepares to take her place in a new reality, a world where her mere presence is enough, where her voice carries the weight of truth, where her silence becomes something sacred, and when her body chooses to desire again, it will be through sacred choice, not through emotional craving or familiar addiction. When love comes again, it won't find a woman hungry for affection. It will find a woman who is full, integrated, and already whole. Until that day, she remains grounded, not in abstinence, but in awareness, in vigil, because now she knows the truth. Yes, the body is still, but it is the soul that has begun to speak. There are silences that seem cold from the outside, but within them, embers burn slow and strong. There are absences that to the world look like loss, but to the soul, they are fertile ground. And there are women who, when they pull away from the noise of the world, do not extinguish. They ignite on a different plane. When the body falls into quiet, it is not because it has withered. It is because it has become an altar, a sacred space where the soul, at long last, finds the courage to speak its first real word. And everything that once appeared like a lack of life now reveals itself as divine presence in disguise, gestating a new identity that is clearer, rarer, and whole. Nothing that's been lived is ever lost. Everything is transmuted. Desire, once an urgency, transforms into conscious choice. Pain, once a wound, becomes a scar etched with wisdom. The woman who walks through abstinence with eyes wide open is not retreating from love. She is learning to love again, but this time from abundance, not from hunger. And in that quiet fullness, she becomes untouchable, not because no one can reach her, but because no one can manipulate her anymore. Can you feel the faint echo of this journey within yourself, that unnamed nostalgia? The strange discomfort of not fitting where you once felt at home. The urge to retreat, even when you're unsure why. That is not weakness. It is the very first call. And perhaps this video didn't find you by accident. Perhaps it is a mirror held up to a part of you that has been silently pulsing all along, waiting to be named. And now that it has, something within you has shifted. If this path touched something sacred and forgotten in you, then honor it. Let the flame stay lit. Share this message with someone whose body has gone quiet, but who still doesn't understand why. Leave a comment below to tell us what part of this spoke to you. And if you feel called to walk further on this path with us, on this same depth and truth, subscribe to the channel here Every word is a seed, every silence, soil, and every video, a ritual, because in the end, this is what remains. A woman who has learned to listen when the world is far too loud, and that whisper she hears now says, "You are not alone. You are awakening."